blood and betrayal stain the steps of the silver throne. He swore she was his soul's only equal until the crown demanded a monster she couldn't be. Thrown to the wolves, she didn't die. She became their god. This is the tragic, triumphant history of a fractured kingdom. The year was 1342 in the sovereign kingdom of Valerius, a sprawling territory nestled between the treacherous Frosthorn Mountains and the Whispering Sea. Historical records often sanitize the events of the autumn equinox, painting King Cedric of House Hasting as a pragmatic ruler who made a difficult sacrifice for his people. But the hidden pack journals and private letters of the nobility tell a far more visceral, devastating story of ambition, betrayal, and a shattered mate bond. At 24, Cedric was the newly crowned Alpha King of the Silver Crest, a pack that had ruled Valerius for 3 centuries. He was physically imposing, possessing a jet-black wolf that struck terror into the hearts of his enemies. Yet Cedric inherited a fragile throne. The northern borders were bleeding, besieged by feral rogue factions, and the royal treasury was dangerously depleted. He needed a formidable queen, an alpha female whose bloodline could command respect and whose family could supply a ruthless army. Instead, the moon goddess gave him Lady Isolde of House Montgomery. Isolde was a woman of breathtaking, albeit delicate, beauty. She possessed striking raven hair and eyes the color of a tempestuous ocean, but in a society that valued fangs and claws above all else, she was considered a tragic liability. At 20 years old, her wolf had never manifested. In the harsh societal hierarchy of Valerius, an unshifted werewolf was an anomaly, a genetic failure whispered to be cursed. Her father, Lord Frederick Montgomery, had spent his entire fortune on healers and mystics, desperately trying to force his daughter's transition. But nothing worked. Isolde remained bound to her fragile human form, trapped in a pack that viewed her with a mixture of pity and disgust. Despite this, she and Cedric had shared a tender, secret romance since youth. Beneath the shadow of the palace gardens, Cedric had promised her that he would protect her, that her lack of a wolf mattered little to the boy who loved her. But the boy was gone. In his place stood a king desperate to hold on to his crown. The Equinox Gala was meant to be the night Cedric announced his chosen queen. The great hall was a sea of velvet, iron, and political tension. Dukes, lords, and alpha generals from across the continent were in attendance, their keen senses waiting for the scent of the royal mate. Among them was Lady Gwendolen of House Herring, a towering, fierce alpha female whose dowry included 10,000 armored Lycan warriors. When the celestial clock struck midnight, the fated mate bond snapped into place. It was a tangible electric surge that ripped through the great hall. The scent of rain-soaked pine and sweet jasmine flooded Cedric's senses, yanking his gaze directly to the back of the room where Isolde stood. Isolde gasped, clutching her chest as the profound soul-deep connection ignited her veins. She looked at Cedric, her eyes wide with a mixture of overwhelming love and sudden terror. The moon goddess had tethered them. They were soulmates. The room fell deadly silent. The elite alphas of the court sniffed the air, their expressions morphing from confusion to outright horror as they traced the king's mate bond to the wolfless runt of House Montgomery. Cedric stood frozen on the dais. He looked at Isolde, seeing the desperate hope trembling on her lips. Then he looked at Lady Gwendolen, who stood rigid, her eyes narrowing as the political implications set in. If Cedric accepted a weak human mate, the northern clans would rebel by morning. His reign would collapse in a tide of blood. The choice before him was agonizing, but Cedric's ambition proved stronger than his soul. He stepped forward, his voice magically amplified to echo off the stone walls. "The moon goddess tests us," Cedric announced, his tone as cold as a winter's grave. He did not look at Isolde as he spoke. "She tests the resolve of a king to see if he will choose personal indulgence over the survival of his people. A king cannot mate with a fragile human. Valerius requires a warrior. Valerius requires power." Isolde felt the words like physical blades sliding between her ribs. "Cedric," she whispered, stepping forward, the mating bond crying out in agony at his distance. "I, King Cedric of House Hasting," he bellowed, finally meeting her tear-filled eyes, his own flashing with a cruel golden light, "hereby reject you, Lady Isolde of House Montgomery, as my fated mate. You are unfit for the crown. You are a genetic disgrace to our kind. The rejection of a true mate is not merely a social slight. It is a violent physiological trauma." When Cedric spoke the ancient words of severing, Isolde screamed. It was a harrowing, blood-curdling sound that forced several lords to cover their ears. She collapsed to the stone floor, convulsing as the spiritual tether connecting her soul to Cedric's was violently ripped apart. Blood dripped from her nose and ears. Lord Frederick rushed forward to catch his daughter, his face pale with shock. "My king, I beg of you," he pleaded. "She will not survive the night. The rejection will kill her. Then let her die in the wilderness, where her weakness belongs," Cedric replied. His jaw clenched so tightly it threatened to shatter. He turned his back on her, extending his hand to Lady Gwendolen. "By dawn, Isolde Montgomery is banished from the kingdom of Valerius. If she is found within my borders, she will be executed as a rogue." As Isolde was dragged out of the great hall, barely conscious and dying from the severed bond, she caught one final glimpse of Cedric. He was slipping a ruby ring onto Gwendolen's finger, sealing a pact of power forged in the ashes of Isolde's soul. Banishment into the Deadwood was a well-known death sentence. The forest, stretching beyond the eastern borders of Valerius, was a sunless, freezing labyrinth infested with violent rogues and starved predators. For 3 days, Isolde wandered the freezing terrain. The physical agony of the rejected mate bond felt like a phantom fire burning in her chest. Her silk dress was torn to shreds, her skin bruised and bleeding from the harsh elements. She was delirious, surviving only on handfuls of snow and an unnatural, bubbling rage that had begun to replace her heartbreak. She realized that Cedric hadn't just broken her heart. He had humiliated her, discarded her like spoiled meat, all for a crown he was too weak to hold on his own. On the 4th night, the shadows of the Deadwood moved. 3 massive, heavily scarred rogue wolves emerged from the tree line. Their eyes were manic with hunger. Isolde backed up against a massive oak tree, her breath misting in the freezing air. She had no weapons. She had no wolf. She was going to die here, forgotten and discarded. The largest rogue lunged, its jaws snapping shut around her forearm. Pain, sharp and blinding, exploded through her nervous system. But as the beast's teeth sank into her flesh, something ancient and dormant snapped violently awake inside Isolde. The trauma of the rejection, the freezing cold, and the imminent threat of death acted as a brutal catalyst. A profound, blinding heat erupted from her chest. It wasn't the agonizing burn of a severed bond. It was a supernova of pure, unadulterated lunar energy. Isolde threw her head back and unleashed a scream that did not sound human. It was a guttural, earth-shaking roar. Her bones began to break and reform with terrifying speed. The rogues backed away, whining in sudden instinctual terror as the ambient magic in the air grew so heavy it cracked the bark of the surrounding trees. She did not shift into a normal wolf. When the agonizing transformation was complete, A beast of legendary proportions stood in the clearing. She was easily twice the size of a standard alpha, standing nearly 7 feet tall at the shoulder. But it was her coat that defied reality. She was not brown, gray, or black. She was a blinding, luminescent white, glowing with an ethereal silver aura. Her eyes, once human blue, were now a glowing, predatory violet. She was a pure-blood Lycan. Not just a Lycan, but a manifestation of the imperial bloodline. The original sovereign rulers of the werewolf species, thought to have been wiped out centuries ago. The rogues didn't stand a chance. With a speed that blurred the air, Isolde's wolf tore through them. It wasn't a fight. It was a slaughter. When the snow was stained red and the threat was neutralized, she let out a triumphant howl that shook the very foundation of the Frosthorn Mountains. Miles away, a specialized tracking unit had heard the commotion. Emerging from the snowy mist were 5 heavily armored Lycans, moving with military precision. They were led by Commander Gideon, a formidable warrior bearing the crest of a silver sun. When Gideon saw the massive white wolf standing amidst the carnage, he immediately dropped to his knees in the blood-soaked snow, bowing his head in absolute submission. His men followed suit instantly. By the goddess. Gideon breathed, his voice trembling with reverence. The prophecy is true. We have found you. Isolde was escorted deep into the impassable peaks of the Frostons, passing through a powerful magical cloaking barrier that revealed a sprawling, magnificent city carved directly into the white stone of the mountain. This was Aethelgard, the hidden sanctuary of the Imperial Lycan court. In the grand throne room, Isolde, now back in her human form and wrapped in luxurious furs, stood before Queen Seraphina. The ancient Lycan queen stepped down from her throne, her eyes wide as she took in Isolde's scent. For 500 years, House Hasting has told the world they eradicated the imperial line, Seraphina said, her voice echoing with ancient authority. Your ancestors hid your bloodline, binding the wolf spirit with dark magic so it would not manifest and draw the king's attention. They made you appear weak to keep you alive. You are not a Montgomery child. You are a direct descendant of the first king. Over the next 3 years, Isolde was reborn. The weak, fawning girl who had begged for Cedric's love was systematically dismantled. Under Gideon's brutal tutelage, she learned to control her massive Lycan form, mastering ancient combat arts and military strategy. Under Queen Seraphina, she learned the ruthless politics of the supernatural world. She grew cold, calculating, and breathtakingly powerful. When Queen Seraphina peacefully passed into the goddess's embrace, the imperial court unanimously crowned Isolde as their reigning sovereign. Meanwhile, back in Valerius, King Cedric's realm was crumbling. The alliance with Lady Gwendolen had been a disaster. Gwendolen was cruel and demanding, and her army was undisciplined. The rogue factions had evolved into an organized rebellion, steadily pushing into Cedric's territory. His people were starving, his borders were collapsing, and the treasury was empty. Desperate, Cedric sent emissaries to the legendary, mythical imperial court, begging for an audience and military aid. He offered trade routes, gold he didn't have, and political submission. In the high peaks of Aethelgard, Isolde read Cedric's desperate scroll. A dark, predatory smile curved her lips, one that made even Commander Gideon shiver. "Tell King Cedric of Valerius," Isolde commanded, her violet eyes flashing with the promise of vengeance, "that the sovereign of Ethelgard will attend his summit at the Silver Crest, and tell him to prepare his court for royalty." The stage was set. The Alpha King who chose power over his mate was about to discover that true power didn't wear a crown of gold. It wore a coat of pure glowing white. and it was coming home. The great hall of Valerius, once a beacon of unyielding power, now mirrored the decay of its ruler. King Cedric sat upon the silver throne, his posture stiff, the dark circles beneath his eyes betraying countless sleepless nights. The tapestries hanging from the stone walls, depicting the glorious conquests of House Hastings, were frayed and covered in a thin layer of soot from the failing hearths. Winter had come early to the kingdom of Valerius, and it brought with it the bitter sting of starvation and unrest. The rebellion in the northern territories, led by vicious rogue factions, had crippled their supply lines. Cedric's kingdom was bleeding to death, and the crown resting heavily upon his brow felt like a ring of thorns. Beside him slouched Queen Gwendolen of House Herring. 3 years of marriage had dissolved any illusion of a formidable partnership. Gwendolen was brash, arrogant, and entirely unbothered by the suffering of the common folk. She drank heavily from a goblet of fermented plum wine, her armored boots resting disrespectfully on the edge of the royal dais. The 10,000 Lycan warriors she had brought as her dowry were poorly disciplined, prone to pillaging their own allied villages rather than fighting the rogues. Cedric's grand sacrifice, trading his fated mate for military might, had proven to be a catastrophic miscalculation. "They are late," Gwendolen sneered, wiping a drop of wine from her chin. "This so-called sovereign of Aethelgard plays games with us, Cedric. We should not be begging some mythical mountain hermit for salvation. My soldiers can crush the rebellion if you just give the order to burn the northern forests to the ash." "Your soldiers," Cedric snapped, his golden eyes flashing with barely contained exhaustion and rage, "were routed at the Battle of Whispering Pines by a disorganized mob of starving rogues. We need the Imperial Court's resources, Gwendolen. We need their gold, and we need their legendary discipline. You will show this sovereign the utmost respect, or I will have you removed from the hall." Before Gwendolen could spit a venomous reply, the massive oak doors of the great hall shuddered. A deafening blast from a silver horn echoed through the stone corridors, vibrating deep within the chests of every werewolf present. The ambient temperature in the room plummeted. The heavy iron chandelier swung wildly as a wave of pure, unadulterated magical pressure rolled into the hall. Elite alpha generals, men who had slaughtered hundreds in battle, instinctively fell to their knees, their wolves whimpering in the face of an overwhelmingly superior aura. The heavy doors swung outward with a thunderous crash. Standing in the archway were 20 Imperial Lycan guards, towering behemoths clad in gleaming pearl-white armor. They moved in perfect, terrifying unison, forming a corridor of silver spears. Commander Gideon stepped forward, his silver sun crest catching the flickering torchlight. Presenting the sovereign of the Imperial Court of Aethelgard, Gideon's voice boomed, carrying a supernatural weight that forced Cedric to grip the armrests of his throne to remain seated. The White Empress, the true bloodline. A solitary figure stepped into the great hall. She was draped in a magnificent, hooded cloak of spun silver and midnight velvet, concealing her face and form. Yet the sheer magnitude of her presence was suffocating. As she glided down the velvet carpet toward the dais, the air crackled with purple lightning. The scent of rain-soaked pine and sweet jasmine, a scent Cedric had desperately tried to scrub from his memory for 3 agonizing years, flooded the vast room. Cedric's heart stopped. The blood drained from his face, leaving him as pale as a corpse. His inner wolf, which had been sullen and lethargic since the Equinox Gala, suddenly slammed against the cages of his mind, howling in a chaotic frenzy of recognition, longing, and immense sorrow. The sovereign reached the base of the dais. Slowly, deliberately, she reached up with hands adorned in ancient runic rings and pushed the hood back from her head. A collective gasp echoed through the great hall. Lord Frederick Montgomery, standing among the minor nobles, dropped his walking cane. It clattered loudly against the stone floor. Isolde stood before them, but she was no longer the fragile, desperate, unshifted girl they had banished to the deadwood. She was a vision of terrifying, godlike majesty. Her raven hair fell in perfect, cascading waves down her back, interwoven with subtle strands of glowing silver. Her eyes, once a gentle ocean blue, were now a glowing, predatory, luminescent violet. She wore an armored gown of white dragon scale and silver filigree, hugging a warrior's physique that radiated lethal grace. "Isolde," Cedric whispered, the word tearing itself from his throat like a jagged piece of glass. He stood up slowly, entirely forgetting the protocols of court. He took a stumbling step forward. You are dead. The deadwood was merely a crucible, King Cedric," Isolde spoke. Her voice was a dark, melodic symphony, layered with the terrifying, dual-toned resonance of an alpha Lycan. It commanded absolute silence. It burned away the weakness you so graciously discarded. "I must thank you. Had you not thrown me to the wolves, I would never have remembered that I was born to rule them." Gwendolen, sensing the shift in the room and the utter devotion in Cedric's horrified gaze, stood up furiously, her fangs descending. "What trickery is this? You are a banished runt. A defect guard sees this impostor." Not a single Valerius guard moved. They couldn't. Isolde's aura had completely paralyzed them, establishing an absolute, unquestionable dominance over every werewolf in the vicinity. Isolde merely tilted her head, looking at Gwendolen with profound boredom. A defect, Isolde mused, a cruel, beautiful smile touching her lips. Is that what they call the imperial bloodline these days? How quaint. The revelation hung in the air like an executioner's blade. The imperial bloodline. The myth that House Hastings had built their entire dynasty upon destroying. Cedric felt his knees buckle. The ancient texts in his private library detailed the violet-eyed sovereigns, creatures of immense, unparalleled magic and physical dominance. They were the true rulers of the werewolf species, and he had thrown one away like garbage. "You came here to gloat," Cedric managed to say, his voice trembling as he desperately tried to project a strength he no longer possessed. "You received my emissaries. You know the state of my kingdom. You came to watch us burn, Isolde." "I am not Isolde the Montgomery runt," she corrected sharply, taking a deliberate step up the dais. The magical pressure intensified, forcing Cedric back into his throne. "I am Sovereign Isolde of Ethelgard, and I did not come to watch you burn, Cedric. I came to extinguish you." She signaled with 2 fingers. Commander Gideon stepped forward, unrolling a heavy parchment. "The terms of salvation are absolute," Gideon announced. "The Imperial Court will deploy 10 legions to crush the rogue rebellion. We will open our granaries to feed your starving populace. We will stabilize the borders and restore prosperity to this continent." Cedric's eyes widened with desperate hope. "And in return, what is the price?" "Your crown," Isolde said softly, her violet eyes locking onto his. "Your kingdom, and your absolute submission. House Hastings will step down. Valerius will be absorbed into the Imperial Empire. You will abdicate here tonight before your lords, or I will march my armies back to the Frosthorns and leave you to the slaughter." Outrage erupted from the nobility, but it was quickly silenced by a low, rumbling growl from the Imperial Guards. Gwendolen, however, completely lost her composure. Humiliated and furious, she shoved Cedric aside and drew a massive broadsword from her hip. "I am the Queen of Valerius." Gwendolen roared, her body expanding rapidly as she partially shifted, thick grey fur sprouting along her arms. "I command the Harring legions. I will not surrender my throne to a ghost." With a reckless feral scream, Gwendolen launched herself off the dais, bringing the heavy steel blade down in a deadly arc aimed directly at Isolde's neck. Isolde did not even blink. She did not draw a weapon. As the blade was inches from her skin, Isolde's arm moved with a speed that defied the laws of physics. Her hand, now tipped with terrifying luminescent silver claws, caught the flat of the broadsword. With a casual flick of her wrist, she shattered the enchanted steel into a dozen jagged pieces. Before Gwendolen could process the destruction of her weapon, Isolde's hand shot forward, wrapping around Gwendolen's throat. The force of the impact lifted the towering alpha female entirely off the ground. Isolde's eyes flared violently bright. The great hall trembled as the ambient magic coalesced. "You speak of legions, little queen," Isolde whispered, her Lycan voice vibrating through the stone. "You speak of power. Let me show you what true power looks like." Isolde unleashed a fraction of her inner beast. A blinding, ethereal white light erupted from her body. For a brief, terrifying second, the massive 7-foot-tall spiritual projection of the White Empress, the legendary imperial wolf, superimposed itself over Isolde's human form. The raw divine dominance radiating from the phantom wolf slammed into the room. Every single werewolf in the great hall, including King Cedric, was violently forced flat to the floor. Their bones ached, their inner wolves whimpering in absolute unconditional submission to their ancestral god. Gwendolen gasped for air, her eyes rolling back in her head out of sheer terror, before Isolde casually tossed her aside like a broken doll. Gwendolen hit a stone pillar and slumped to the ground, unconscious and utterly defeated. The oppressive pressure lifted just enough to allow Cedric to raise his head. He looked at the magnificent, terrifying woman standing before him. The crushing weight of regret threatened to stop his heart. He had chosen a crown of rust over a goddess. Desperation clawed at Cedric's mind. He remembered the love they once shared, the gentle touches in the palace gardens. Slowly, painfully, he crawled forward on his hands and knees until he was at Isolde's feet. "Isolde, please," Cedric wept, tears streaming down his face, completely destroying whatever remained of his kingly dignity. "I was a fool. I was terrified of losing the kingdom. But the bond. The moon goddess chose us. We can restore the bond. We can rule together. You and I as it was meant to be. I will cast Gwendolen out. Please, my love, forgive me." Isolde looked down at the broken man weeping at her feet. There was no anger in her violet eyes. There was no hatred. There was only the cold, unfeeling void of the abyss. "The moon goddess tested you, Cedric," Isolde said quietly, echoing the exact words he had spoken to her 3 years ago. She tested the resolve of a king to see if he possessed a soul worthy of a true mate. You failed. She reached down, grabbing Cedric by the jaw, forcing him to look up into her luminescent eyes. "I, sovereign Isolde of the imperial bloodline," she decreed, her voice ringing out with absolute finality, "hereby formally accept the severing of our bond. You are unfit for my presence. You are a disgrace to our kind." The ancient magic of the final severance lashed out. Cedric screamed, clutching his chest as the last remaining ashes of his soul's connection were violently ripped away, leaving a gaping, agonizing void. He collapsed onto the cold stone, a shattered, broken shell of an alpha. Isolde stepped over him without a second glance. She ascended the dais, her silver cloak billowing behind her. She turned, looking out over the lords, generals, and nobles of Valerius, who remained kneeling on the floor in absolute reverence. Slowly, deliberately, she took her seat upon the silver throne. "The kingdom of Valerius is dissolved," Sovereign Isolde announced to the silent, kneeling masses. "The empire of Aethelgard has returned. Let those who pledge loyalty rise. Let those who resist be fed to the wolves." One by one, the lords of Valerius stood and bowed deeply to the White Empress. Lord Frederick Montgomery stepped forward, tears of overwhelming pride shining in his eyes, and dropped to one knee before his daughter. King Cedric of House Hastings was dragged away into the shadows, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. The era of false kings was over. The eternal reign of the White Empress had begun. The White Empress reclaimed her throne, proving that true power is born from the ashes of betrayal. Did Isolde make the right choice in destroying Cedric, or should she have shown mercy? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this dramatic medieval werewolf tale of vengeance and royal destiny, smash that like button, share this story with your fellow pack members, and subscribe to a channel for more epic supernatural romance audiobooks every single week.